Good afternoon. My name is Erwin Chemerinsky, and I have the great pleasure of being the Dean of Berkeley Law. One of the most special events every year in the law school is the Herma Hill Kay Memorial Lecture. Herma was a legendary figure in the history of Berkeley law, but also in legal education. She got her law degree at the University of Chicago. She clerked on the California Supreme Court, and then she joined the faculty here at Berkeley Law in 1961. She was the second woman to be a member of the faculty at Berkeley. She specialized in family law, in conflicts of law, in the then emerging field of sex discrimination law. In fact, she and Ruth Bader Ginsburg co-authored the first casebook on sex discrimination in the law. In addition to being a beloved professor at Berkeley for so many years, she also served as the dean at Berkeley Law from 1992 to 2000, the first woman to hold that position. She remained a very active member of the Berkeley community until she passed away in 2017. Pam Samuelson, who's here today, and Robert Glushko decided they wanted to endow a lecture in memory of Herma Hill Kay, and many of the faculty then contributed. The inaugural lecture was given by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2019. And I'm so thrilled that today we have the 8th Herma Hill Kay Memorial Lecturer, Professor Anita Allen. She received her undergraduate degree from New College, a JD from Harvard Law School, a PhD in philosophy at the University of Michigan. She then became a professor. She's had a very distinguished academic career. According to Wikipedia, she's published over 150 law review articles. She's now the Henry Silverman Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She's also a professor of philosophy there. In addition to all of her scholarly accomplishments, she's also very much an administrator. From 2013 to 2020, she served as the vice provost for faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. I could spend all of the rest of the next hour just telling you her immense qualifications. She's won so many awards. I'll mention just one. The Berkeley Center for Law and Technology gave her the Privacy Scholar Award just a couple of years ago. So please join me in welcoming Professor Anita Allen, this year's Herma Hill Kay Memorial Lecturer.
Thank you, Erwin. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an incredible honor to be on the same placard as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, my mentor from law school, Martha Minow, and other distinguished judges and faculty. So it's just a huge honor, and thank you so much for inviting me. I wanted to give special thanks to Pam Samuelson for her role in creating this lectureship, but I also want to thank her for something that may be a little bit more surprising. So when I first started teaching now 40 years ago, 40, this is my 40th anniversary of teaching law, Pam Samuelson was assigned as my faculty mentor and advisor at the University of Pittsburgh Law School, where she was already, I believe, a tenured member of the faculty. And poor Pam, her job, among other things, was to visit my classes and give me some advice on teaching. And so after visiting my class, she gave me some advice, which I think at the time went down badly, but I think in retrospect was the most brilliant piece of advice I ever got. She said, Anita, massage the cases more. Massage the cases more. So Pam, I've been trying over the years to massage those cases, and I'm massaging them to death. And I hope that were you to come back and visit my class, you would agree that I've learned how to massage those cases. But it was great advice, and I give that same advice to any junior faculty who are just starting teaching. It's not about the whole thing, right? It's about the politics, the context, the economics, the theory. It's about all kinds of things. So thank you, Pam. I decided today that I wanted to talk about a privacy topic, but maybe not one that is so much about digital or electronic privacy in a very direct sense. But I think the talk has some implications perhaps for some contemporary issues. My colleague Jennifer Rothman and I have just completed and published an article in the Michigan Law Review. It came out about last week, called Postmortem Privacy, and it's all about the privacy rights of the dead. And I hope you'll have a chance to take a look at the article. And this talk I'm going to give today is an essay that I wrote for another publication, a philosophy anthology about the Emmett Till case, recognizing its 70th anniversary. But I draw on some of the things that I learned as I did my research for postmodern privacy. I drew on those things in developing a perspective on the ethics of Mamie Till's decision to open the casket, rendering public that which is normally private. So here I go. So Mamie Till-Mobley was the mother, as you know, of Emmett Till. And she is praised today for being courageous. But I want to ask the question, was she as ethical as she was courageous? She, in 1955, defied the orders of the Tutwiler Funeral Home that she not open the casket of her son when it was shipped from Mississippi, where he had been murdered, back to Chicago for a funeral and burial. 14-year-old Emmett's body was, as you know, greatly battered. The men who killed Emmett Till not only dragged him from his home, but they also beat him to a pulp. They tied a fan around his neck with barbed wire. They shot him, and they threw his weighted body into the Tallahatchie River like trash. These wrongdoers, J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant, were tried in a court of law. This is the funeral, the temple where he was memorialized. But these two men who killed him were tried in a court of law, acquitted by an all-white jury, and following their acquittal, they just openly admitted, yeah, we did it. And they published an article in the Look magazine in which they just brazenly admitted that they had murdered this poor little boy. And of course, there were no consequences due to double jeopardy for having made that admission. So thousands of people saw Emmett Till's battered corpse over a 3-day period of mourning, and millions eventually saw it through photographs. Mamie's choice was to open the casket, and it was sometimes described as, has been sometimes described as the spark that galvanized the civil rights movement, the spark that galvanized the civil rights movement. And yet, there were some people who didn't think that so much attention should be paid to Emmett Till's death. And among those people was Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was arguing at the time that black people should pay less attention to these lynchings and more attention to the large-scale litigation efforts on behalf of non-discrimination and democracy, such as he himself was advancing. So grateful to Thurgood Marshall for his 1954 victory in Brown versus Board, grateful for him for all that he did. But I think he got this thing wrong. I think as the world has witnessed with the public killings of George Floyd in 2020, and subsequent explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a role for litigation, but there's also a role for public display of our grief over public killings of African-American men and women. As one person I'm going to quote has said, today, more so today in the digital age than in the 1950s, life and image are fully conjoined and integrated, mutually referential and reflexive. So gazing at the gruesome dead firsthand through photographic images can prompt moral discernment. Contemplating a corpse's reality can be a way to help fight objectification and can represent a response to, a legitimate response to our sorrow, our rage, our conscience, and ultimately prompt our solidarity. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Mamie Till had been with Emmet in Mississippi when he was dragged from his home and murdered. Maybe she would have been dragged from her home and murdered too. Why do I say that? Because there was a case in Oklahoma you may have heard of from 1911 involving Laura Nelson and L.D. Nelson. This is Laura D. and L.D. Nelson, who were hung from a bridge. They were both lynched, mother and son. And so in that instance, the mother could not be the courageous exerciser of moral autonomy and challenge racism and terror, because she also was a co-victim of terror. It's just good luck, in a sense, perversely, good luck that Mamie Till was not with her son and could not have been murdered, and was therefore able to exercise a kind of maternal agency that Laura Nelson was stripped of because she happened to be with her son and co-accused with her son. Under American law, one's designees have the right to make decisions about the disposition of our remains. Emmett Till's mother acted within the bounds of discretion of the laws of sepulcher. And there's also sepulcher, the laws that determine, the common law that determines what has to be done and what can be done and cannot be done to the dead. Till's mother took a big ethical risk, though, I believe, when she violated what are some of the common norms of burial among her own community members when she elected to open a closed casket. She displayed the battered corpse, inviting public gaze at her once handsome son, who could not be made handsome again. We can never know, of course, what Emmet himself would have wanted for his burial, right? We don't know what he would have wanted, but and he would have been, in theory, old enough to decide, hey, I'm 14 years old. If this ever happened to me, here's what I want. But he didn't exercise any such judgment. She made her own decision, and it may have been against what he would have wanted for himself. But she would say that she allowed his face, his brutalized visage, to become an icon, the ugly face of racism. So it's the ethics of Till-Mobley's important decision that I probe with deepest empathy here. I want to broach the ethical edge of whether displaying the dead and encouraging others to look at the dead are ever wrong from a dignitarian or human flourishing moral point of view. It may seem odd to you that I'm asking an ethical question about Mamie Till. I think that public moralizing is always a little bit awkward and fraught, but as a scholar, not only of law, but of ethics, I think it's appropriate to ask hard ethical questions about whether or not decisions that are made by people we admire are always the right decision. So in that spirit, I'm asking this question about dead display and dead gazing. Dead display meaning putting the body on display, as Mamie did. Dead gazing, that which was encouraged by the display, the public to look upon the visage. I think there are two sort of sets of moral concerns that one might have about dead display and dead gazing. One is about whether dead display and dead gazing inflict emotional distress on the living of a sort that should not be inflicted. And the second thing that I want to raise in this regard is whether dead display and dead gazing are actually disrespectful to the deceased. I'm going to conclude that while displays of dead African Americans have a complex ethical valence in history, that Till-Mobley's fortuitously well-timed decision to display her son's corpse to the world against a background of exploitative and racist lynching spectacle honored her son's common humanity. Till-Mobley succeeded at the nearly impossible, which is rehumanizing and de-objectifying an innocent boy by allowing us to view him with our discerning gazes through the mother's loving eyes. So let me start with the issue of the emotional impact on the living. One of the most cited cases when it comes to issues around prurient viewing of the dead is the case of Katsouris versus Department of California Highway Patrol. And in this case, tragically, a young woman's a body was decapitated in a horrible car accident. Her parents sued for invasion of privacy when some members of the California Department of Highway Patrol took images of the horrible accident showing the decapitated body and put them online. And online, not for any legitimate purpose, but just for the purpose of prurient spectacle and morbid humor. So the court in that case found that death images are private, their content is not a matter of legitimate public concern, and their purient dissemination is, quote, offensive and objectionable to a reasonable person. In another case that is worth mentioning, but this one from more recently, a more recent case, and also from not California but Oklahoma. In this case, a woman had a miscarriage in the hospital, and after that, she of course went home, and a couple days later, she received in the mail some photographs, and someone in the hospital had, thinking they're doing her a favor, had taken the little miscarried fetus and manipulated it into a lifelike position and put little angel wing props on it and photographed it, and they sent this to the mother unsolicited. Well, she was horrified and felt that both the privacy of herself and the fetus had been violated. The Oklahoma Supreme Court allowed the plaintiff's claim respecting her own privacy, arguing that the death was, quote, more personal to Gilbo, the name of the woman, more personal to Gilbo than anyone else in the world. The right to control how remains were handled belonged to Gilbo, belonged to the mother. And one might say the same for Till-Mobley, that the death of Emmet was more personal to her than anyone else, and the right to control how her child's remains were treated belonged to her. In a related vein, once again, turning to California law, Vanessa Bryant received a $28 million settlement after Los Angeles deputy sheriffs circulated gruesome, unauthorized photographs of Kobe and their daughter after the helicopter crash that we all know so much about, suggesting here too that there's an interest, a legal interest that maybe has a moral component to it that places the right to control death images in the hands of the next of kin, the mother, the wife. Exposing to view a corpse you have no right to control, contrary to custom and practice, can thus be an act of moral and legal offense. But it would appear that in our society, in our culture, there are some nuanced social norms that permit a wide variety of types of dead gazing. And so think about all the catacombs, and you've probably seen the catacombs in Rome or Paris, piles of bones piled up. Tourists go there. It's a great attraction, popular attraction. We don't get horrified by that or think somehow something wrong is happening, at least not most of the time. Egyptian mummies are on display in all the great world museums, including at my own Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia. I went to see the Treasures of King Tut exhibit at the Field Museum in Chicago in 1977 that also attracted 1.3 million other visitors. So there's a tradition of viewing the dead, and ethical concerns are not typically raised by those kinds of things. Now, one might be tempted to say that there's an ethical distinction between viewing or displaying the long dead versus the recently dead. And whereas the long dead, not a problem, the recently dead could be a problem. But I think that actually displaying the long dead can be a problem as well. This is an image of a man called Fortune, who was an enslaved African American. His master, his owner, when he died, boiled and flayed Fortune's corpse to extract the skeleton. And then he used the skeleton for purposes of medical education. And then eventually the skeleton was placed in a museum. And it was there for a very, very, very long time, for more than 200 years. Only in 2013 did the African American community get possession of these bones and were able to give Fortune a dignified burial. You all know the case of the Harvard case, right, from a few years ago, where Harvard University was sued by Tamara Lanier because it was claiming the right to possess daguerreotypes of enslaved black individuals whom Tamara said were her ancestors, and so. She lost her case, but in any event, alleged that Harvard mishandled somehow her claims, and also that there was an issue of privacy and property in Harvard continuing to display these images for which African Americans posed involuntarily for purposes of racist research, which was an attempt to prove the theory of polygenesis, that black people and white people come from totally different sources. So it's not about how old the things are. I think there can be some ethical sensitivities around long dead as well as recently dead bodies. Disrespecting the dead is sort of a second, so the feelings of the living matter, but the respect for the dead, this idea that the dead deserve respect in their own right, is another sort of line of thinking about dead display, and about dead gazing. And I think there are at least 4 different perspectives from which one can think about why it might be disrespectful to gaze upon the dead. One of them is that there may be some ignoring of the wishes of the dead involved, and that could be disrespectful. Another thing could be that you're physically abusing the corpses. Another thing could be that you're appropriating or exploiting their identities. Another thing could be that you're speaking badly of them. So these are sort of 4 different ways of disrespecting the dead. I just want to briefly comment on them. So ignoring wishes. There's a case that the slide notes in which an American Jewish woman wanted to be buried in Israel. And she wanted to be buried in Israel so badly that she actually purchased a plot in which to be buried in Israel. And when she died, her family broke out into a fight over whether they would ship the body to Israel or they would keep the body in the US. And some family members wanted to keep the body in the US and some wanted to have it shipped to Israel. So a lawsuit ensued, and the court eventually found that the woman's preference, wish that she be buried in Israel should be honored, and so it was honored. It would have been arguably morally disrespectful, ethically disrespectful, as well as illegal, to not allow the remains to go to Israel. But showing respect for the dead isn't merely a matter of doing what the dead wish. It's really complicated, because sometimes what the dead wish shows a lack of self-respect and maybe even may involve some social harm. And my example of this is the problem of self-immolation. So self-immolators, this is a Tibetan man, self-immolators are people who want to kill themselves through flames in a very public place. They want that gruesome dead image to be out there for people to see in order to promote their political cause. But I think it's worth asking the question whether or not, even though a self-immolator may want to be the object of dead gazing, whether or not it's right that we support that wish. Other examples come to mind. So sometimes people say, well, if people consent to their bodies being put on display in museums or whatever, that ends all the ethical questions. I don't agree with that. There was an exhibition going around the US several years ago called Body World, in which plasticized, posed bodies, dissected and then plasticized and then posed bodies of Chinese people were on display for museum goers to look at and admiring the complexity of the human anatomy and so forth. But I actually was concerned about whether or not the so-called consent that had been obtained by the Chinese was actually legitimate consent. But even if it was legitimate consent, even if these men and women consented to having their bodies on display, I'm not sure we can't ask questions about whether or not we ought to have people's plasticized bodies on display in museums for public viewing. It's a question. So it's an open question in my mind whether Mamie Till was within her sort of moral rights to do what she did, even though clearly, pretty clearly, she was within her legal rights to do what she did. I think it's not inappropriate to ask the question whether there was some disrespect for Emmet involved in allowing his corpse to be viewed, given the condition of the corpse. So abusing the dead and dying, another category of disrespecting the dead. There was a collection called the Morton Cranial Collection in Philadelphia, kept for 200 years. Skulls of at least 19 black Philadelphians were kept in this collection. Disrespectful, given that that these people were not free. But we don't have to go back 200 years to raise similar kinds of concerns. There was a man who recently whose father died in the hospital, a white man, his father died in the hospital. He went to claim the body, and when he went to the hospital, where did he find the body? In a supply closet, unkempt, tubes down his dad's throat, limbs bound together. The body had just been like tossed in the closet for some reason, right? So Emmett Till's corpse was mistreated when thrown into the Tallahatchie River by his killers. But whether it was also further mistreated by being publicly displayed by his mother, that's the question that I'm trying to consider. Appropriation of the body. Third way to disrespect the dead, to appropriate their bodies. We might talk about Henrietta Lacks in this context. Maybe it was some kind of wrongful appropriation to extract her HeLa cells and use them after her death, even to promote research and scientific treatments and therapies, which is a good thing, but was the means the bad thing. There's a case recently where a teenage boy was killed in a car accident, and there was an autopsy. The autopsy was performed in which the brain was removed from the body and not put back into the body, but rather put in the jar and put on a shelf in the coroner's office. So when the boy's body learned that his brain had been retained by the medical examiner, they were outraged, and of course they sued. We have those cases now about harvesting sperm of dead people, dead men. Can dad or the doctor harvest the sperm and have them frozen so that a child can be created, a grandchild can be created in the future? Or can the wife or girlfriend cause the sperm to be harvested for use in the future? Is that use of the body one that we can ethically condone? Is that a way of appropriating the body, or is that just simply something that we as next of kin have a right to do? You know, I can imagine someone saying, well, you know, it looks like Emmett Till's mother appropriated his body for political purposes. That doesn't sound too cool. And you know, she couldn't have been certain that dead gazing would have a positive political outcome or impact. All she knew is that hiding the corpse, the badly damaged corpse, in her view would constitute hiding the utter brutality and inhumanity that racist violence led to and led the boy to suffer. Commercial exploitation. I think part of the Kobe Bryant lawsuit was that Vanessa was concerned that these folks would take these images of her dead daughter and dead husband, and they would sell them to the media and make money, exploit them. Well, that kind of use of the dead, I think, needs to be nipped in the bud, and her lawsuit, I think, may have a deterrent effect on that kind of thing. And then finally, speaking badly of the dead can be a way of disrespecting them. And a case that I love to use for this point is that of an African-American prize fighter named Jack Thompson. Well, Jack Thompson died, and after his death, his sisters ended up suing Ebony magazine, Black magazine, for falsely claiming that he had died, not in the hospital where he actually died, but for some reason the magazine alleged that he had died a, quote, dope-sodden derelict, his knife-scarred body fished from the San Francisco Bay. Where they got that from, nobody knows, but the point here is that speaking badly of the dead is something that may have some legal as well as moral wrongness to it. You can also maybe raise the Emmett Till case in connection with this idea, because the people who accused him, the woman who accused him, Mrs. Bryant, and the men who murdered him spoke falsely of him. They said he had made some kind of inappropriate advance towards the woman, when in fact he had not. He was bad-mouthed, and that led to partly led to the acquittal of his murderers by the all-white jury. So let me turn now to the question of how we honor the dead. So clearly, I'm trying to argue that there are some concerns about the feelings of the living that might prompt us to hold back on dead gazing and dead display. There are also some concerns about respecting the deceased themselves that might lead us to hold back from displaying the dead or gazing at the dead. I now want to talk a little bit about honoring the dead. So the tradition of lynching photography is very well known now. Throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century, images of of public lynchings were common. Photographs were taken, memorabilia were taken, even body parts of the deceased and clothing of the deceased were commercially bought and sold. It was often a conspiracy between the, or I might say a collaboration between the mob and the photographers to make sure there was a good vantage point for the photographers to get great photographs. These were sometimes quickly produced in ad hoc, on the scene dark rooms, and then the pictures readily and quickly made available to the public. Sold in stores, drugstores, on the street, and even door to door. So by the time Emmett Till was killed, a great many people had already seen the ugly face of racism through this whole history of lynching photography. So you might argue that since time and time again, to no avail, the public had seen the ugly face of racism, what was the point of Mamie Till opening that casket so it could be shown once again? And I think that the point was not to do what it could have done, which was simply to instigate further spectacle, but the point was to simply say, my son is a human being, not a saint, not a hero, my son is a human being. When a loving mother is the one to display the brutalized dead, I think it makes a different statement than when the bodies are hung by a noose on a bridge by the racist and for belittlement and disparagement. I think Mamie took a risk, but the risk that she took was probably one that we can feel comfortable with and sanction. But when it comes to open caskets, there's a fine line between honoring the dead and disrespecting the dead. I don't know if anyone here knew Joanne Epps. Joanne was a law professor at Temple University. She was also the dean of the Temple Law School for a while. She was the provost of Temple University. And when she died, she was the acting president of Temple University. One day late in 2023, Joanne suddenly died unexpectedly while she was actually on a stage at an event. And of course, the university wanted to honor her with a memorial service. So they decided to have the service in the Leocoris Sports Arena, a basketball arena. And I was actually the second person in line in order to pay my respects to Joanne. And I remember thinking, this is a really weird place to have a memorial. In the sports arena, this is my feelings, right? In the sports arena, I go in there, and there she is, beautifully displayed. She has little lace gloves on, and her hands are all folded, and she's wearing beautiful clothes. If you knew Joanne, she was a clothes horse. She looked gorgeous. Her hair was all done. She looked perfect. But I personally thought, I wish this was a cathedral and not a sports arena. That was my response. Based on my own, sort of religious background, I would prefer to have my dear friend memorialized in a church. So, in my own family's traditions, when someone dies, you have the body embalmed, it's on display in a funeral home for a couple of days, and then at the funeral, the body is displayed in an open casket. But all of that assumes that the person can be restored using cosmetics and prosthetics to a normal-looking appearance. And I think the most commonly heard cliche at a Black Southern funeral in my family's community is, oh, they look so good. She looks so good. He looks so good. You want people to look good when they die. And so if you can't make them look good, that's the exception to the rule, and you close the casket. But of course, there are many, many other traditions. In some traditions, you bury the person as soon as you can after they die. There's no long wake, etc. Open caskets are a very familiar part of the Catholic tradition. And in this regard, I was fascinated by the case of Sister Mary Wilhelmina. Sister Mary Wilhelmina was the African-American founder and head of a conservative order of nuns in the Midwest called the Benedictines of Mary, Queen of Apostles. Well, after her death, she was exhumed I guess it was 4 years after her death she was exhumed. And she had died, due to old age, and she had not been embalmed. So 4 years later, the nuns dig her up, and they open the casket, and what do they see? Not a stack of bones, but instead they see Sister Wilhelmina looking like Sister Wilhelmina. And she's remarkably well preserved. And her vestments are remarkably well preserved after 4 years of being in the ground. And so they are in awe because this failure to decay may be a sign that she might be what the Catholics call incorruptible and therefore a candidate for sainthood. So now pilgrims flock to the abbey in a small town in Missouri to see and pray before Sister Wilhelmina's corpse. And it's very likely that this corpse on display has been a boon to the abbey's fame and their prosperity. They've got a potential blessed sister on display. Now, we don't know whether Sister Wilhelmina would have wished her corpse to be on display, but it kind of feels like interference with religious values of the sect she founded to much judge or question their decision. And maybe Mamie Till-Mobley, in the final analysis, deserves the same deference as the Benedictine nuns. A final set of thoughts about righteous choices. There is a certain privacy appropriate to death and dying. American law tells us this. The sharing of the final moments of life should be reserved for loved ones. That's a kind of privacy. First responders should not post photographs of disfigured accident, suicide, or crime victims online. That's a kind of privacy. The images of death can be kept from the media. Parents legitimately protect deceased babies from strangers who would gawk at their medical anomalies or turn them into placards, little baby angels. Against the grain of privacy norms, Till's mother decided that his casket should be open to the world to see the materially hideous effects of racism. That which might be deemed appropriately private out of respect for the dead and the emotions of the living was made public in recognition of the human dignity of a young man unjustly killed. She would not allow objectification and dehumanization to hold sway, and moralists, I argue, should not judge this mother badly. On the contrary, we should stress on her behalf that the open casket enabled morally paramount dead gazing at an important inflection point in American history. After World War II, a wider, more inclusive public was more prepared to see racial injustice through black eyes. Jim Crow had just been discredited by the Supreme Court decision in Brown in 1954. Plessy was gone. Separate but equal was gone. Dead letter. Die-hard segregationists were losing ground, and they were boiling mad. Without state and federal law on their side, they knew that it would be harder than ever to isolate white girls and women from black men and boys. I think that in their mind, the thought was, to hell with the Supreme Court. They would resort, as usual, to terror. To preserve white honor and social superiority, they slayed an uppity black Yankee boy, Emmett Till. They were trying to make an example out of him. Fortunately, Till did not become the example they intended. The mother-made visibility of Till's corpse gave the world an opportunity to see her son's worth through her unconditionally loving lenses. History suggested that it wouldn't work, though, because, as I said before, people gotten pretty used to seeing brutalized images of black people. But the time was right. The time was right in 1955 for a penetrating moral discernment through public dead gazing, contemplation that begins with sorrow and rage and proceeds to solidarity, to efforts to repair the ugly face of racism. Even today, gazing through photography at Emmett Till in his casket underscores that their black race, that the black race of people like Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin, which might render them subhuman in other people's eyes, does not render them like disposable trash in our eyes. we as dead gazers are filled with sorrow and rage. As African Americans, we must dig deep into our spirits to find the strength to confront the harsh reality that our equal humanity, our equal dignity is not deeply and truly appreciated by some others. Recently, Black individuals have been at the center of public spectacles in which Black men's deaths and corpses were captured with cell phone cameras and body cams. As Latia Graham has asked, at a time when Black bodies are treated as teaching moments for the larger culture, are those bodies that were broken by the whip or the overseer or the bullet or the police officer ever afforded the opportunity to rest in peace? It turns out that Emmett Till did not rest in peace. He was displayed, he was buried, but there were a couple of cold case efforts to punish his killers, or some of the killers who were not originally indicted. And that meant that his body was exhumed and re-examined. And then the original coffin was put aside, and he was put in a new coffin and reburied. And what happened to the original coffin that he was buried in? Well, initially, it was tossed into a filthy, possum-infested shed at Burr Hill Cemetery. But then it was rediscovered, and it now has been refurbished and is featured in a moving exhibit at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Ironically, no photographs are allowed of the casket. No photographs are allowed of the casket. Why not? The whole world already knows how badly and wrongfully Emmett Till and the Black community have been hurt. Wanting to respect the casket and to curate a museum goer's experience is understandable. You don't want a lot of people standing around taking selfies with the casket. You don't want, as a curator, you don't want that, right? But isn't it kind of futile to try to preserve the dignity of Emmett Till through limiting exposure of his casket? Isn't it kind of futile and maybe in a certain kind of way counterproductive? The casket is already and forever wide open. The casket is wide open forever, and we can't change that. And I think that allowing photography might be a way of enabling potentially powerful new digital moral discernment, a new generation of moral discernment. So I say, let the cameras in. Thanks. Yes, I'm happy to take some questions and comments. Yes.
Anita, what about the war dead? The showing of the dead in Ukraine, the showing of the dead in Gaza, the showing of the people killed on October 7th. Is that, I mean, how do you unpack that from the ethical perspective?
You know,
one thing that immediately occurs to
Yep.
me is that at least in most of so in Israel and Gaza it is more complicated, but in most of the scenes, the photography going back go back to Vietnam and then up to Ukraine. You don't have the parent claiming the body and then the family deliberating and making a decision for itself or in the interests of others. You have the bodies and the body parts just strewn about. In the Israeli-Gaza situation, you have a lot of people in Israel who are claiming the bodies or did claim the bodies of those murdered on October 7th. And you have a lot of the families of the Palestinian, the Gazan civilians who are claiming their bodies. And then you have this much larger context and set of questions about who might own or have control over the decision to display.
Yeah, that's a very important question. So the first thing which came to mind as you began to speak was how after 9/11, we were still at a point in time when many people felt it was inappropriate to show the bodies, people jumping out of the towers and being, smashed on the ground. And we saw virtually no images of that at the time, of those horrific deaths. We saw some people flying. But even the images of the people falling initially were suppressed. So I think that there still was, and probably still is, some sensitivity around journalistic displays of the dead that might be deemed gruesome or upsetting, emotionally disturbing to the viewer. There's some of that left, even though there's also at the same time a strong sense that to underscore the horror of what is happening in Ukraine or in Gaza or in Israel or on the streets of America, it's become more acceptable to show some of the images, especially if you can give, as I tried to at the beginning of my talk, a trigger warning about what's coming. But trigger warnings are not always possible, right? So I think that as cultures, because it's not just one culture, as cultures, there's certain ambivalence about dead display and dead gazing when it's possible for families to exercise some agency with respect to the extent to which their dead are viewed, then it seems as though we like that agency to be protected. But oftentimes that agency is not possible. And in some cases, some sharing of that agency with the government, the military, or some civilian entity might seem to be the right thing to do. So I think that I don't have a crisp answer for you other than to say that I think we're describing these sort of two sides of a set of norms, two extremes in a set of norms that are not, it's not black and white, right, wrong. It's more like, like a little bit nuanced. But thanks for that question.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita, as ever, for an incredibly thoughtful talk that takes starts from a place that is so original. Thank you for that. I wanted to pick up on Joan's question and your response a little bit. As I was watching you go through the pictures and describe the different analyses we might do to decide when display of the dead is ethical or not, you mentioned social harm. And I'm wondering about the sort of types of social harm you have in mind. Mm-hmm. So one seems to certainly be, pain in the living, distress in the living, and what they view. And I'm curious about, Joan's question about war dead and the example of September 11th and the use of the lynching postcard, these displays of death possibly creating a different kind of social harm, which is a sort of inurement to the image in the populace that reduces the sense of harm. I'm not sure why Emmett Till's death was the death that captured the attention, and after all of the lynching postcards, for example, as you mentioned, and maybe that's just unknowable, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts about what it means in terms of general sort of social ethics and how society operates to have many images of death, to have lots of images of death, if that's part of the social harm analysis you have or not, or there are other aspects of it. A middle example, perhaps, would be the Body Worlds exhibit. I don't know if anybody else saw it. I actually saw it when it was in LA. And I read, all the placards are very, they make a big show of the consent. I did not know that the bodies were of Chinese people. You can't tell. They're. I had no idea about any of that. That was new information to me. But I was really thinking a lot about the consent, because if you haven't seen them, they are placed in these extraordinary positions. So, for example, a human body riding on a flayed horse, and you see the different systems of the body, plasticized, etc. And I thought, I'm not a squeamish person, but some of those displays were worrisome to me for a reason that, I was trying to unpack with regards to the consent. And I think that's kind of a middle ground between, the war dead or, so many images of people being killed by cops that, we maybe cease to see them with the same emotional reaction that would move us in a positive direction. And this odd scenario that is putting people on display, but maybe, I don't know if it's inuring people to something that we care about or not.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think about why, given the prevalence of death images from lynching images, that Emmett Till's display had the impact it had. I think it was, as I say in the talk, it was just a fortuitous inflection point, right? That was part of it. We'd had Brown, and there was a time when there was from many points of view, the civil rights movement was at its well underway, but in a kind of a beginning well under its way. And this particular gesture on the part of Mamie Till just, caused it to cap. It's like, why is it that seeing the cop's knee on the neck, why did that have the great, when so many other black people, it's a combination of how widely it's distributed, but also there's some things about just the expressions on the man's face, the sound of the voice captured on cell phone, who took the pic, all that kind of comes together to create a moment where suddenly everyone is horrified by something which is in some ways quite mundane. Another black man gets killed by cops, So I don't have a good answer, but I actually think that, and this is sort of where I struggle the most. I sort of think that that Mamie Till's gesture, it wasn't just that she opened the casket and said, "Here, look." It's that her own righteousness, her own sadness kind of came through, so that we were seeing her son through her eyes. That poignancy was the spark, right? Whereas, we don't often see the expression of the woman whose son is hanging on the bridge, or who, so what we saw in these very beautiful black and white photographs, we saw this agonized woman's brave gesture to say, "Look at my son. This is my son. He's a person." So those small things can have a huge impact. It's like that one photograph from the Vietnam War of one child, naked girl running. It had more impact than thousands of photographs of dead soldiers, and napalm being. It just had more impact. And part of it is about the power of image. And so one of the reasons why I say, let the cameras in the Smithsonian is because clearly images have power. And we need to be able to protect people from images of disrespect, but also to enable those images that are going to invite moral discernment, as I think some images do. Not all, but some can.
Wonderful presentation, Anita.
Oh, hi, Paul.
Hey, hi. It's amazing how images will kind of refract through culture.
Yes.
Which is in part what you're saying, and I find it very convincing about how seeing Emmett Till through his mother's eyes changes it. There's this amazing kind of example of cultural kind of heritage or memories where, Bob Dylan's famous song, Desolation Row, begins with him saying they're selling postcards of the hanging.
Yeah.
And then Dylan researchers figure out that even in Minnesota, where he's growing up as a little boy, there had been a relatively recent lynching. And so there's this whole discussion like maybe that's what he's referring to. So amazing how these things live on, and some do and some don't. What I wanted to ask you about, though, was to go back to Joan's comment about images of the war dead and kind of biometrics privacy twist that I think you'll be interested by, which is the Ukrainians were using biometrics to identify Russian dead soldiers and then going on social media sources using AI and then sending the photographs to mothers and relatives of the dead soldiers at a time where Russia was stonewalling whether these soldiers were missing or what had happened to them, and sending the photograph of the dead Russian soldier and saying, guess what? And informing them of that. And I wonder if you'd like to unpack kind of the ethics of that. With complicated, right? With two nations at war, plus we get the biometrics and AI.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this wouldn't have been possible 70 years ago. It's possible now. And, you might want to say, well, great if you believe that the Ukrainians are the victims of an unjust war, you might think that they should be able to use all kinds of tools, including AI and facial recognition, in order to bring the truth to the Russian people, from whom the truth is being kept. Right? And there's a certain appeal to that kind of a perspective. On the other hand, it's like, for me, the miscarried fetus. Is it kind? Is it right? Is it proper? Is it good to put before someone the death image of their loved one? Is that an act of cruelty? Yes, you may think it's furthering your cause, but are you at the same time committing an act of cruelty? And I think that it may be something that I would think might cross some ethical lines, right? That the cruelty, the cruel impact on the recipient outweighs the value of being able to say to the world, we've killed young Russian men, and we know the numbers, here's the data. I mean, we often in American law, in intellectual property, not intellectual property law, but in copyright law, and also in right to publicity law, we often distinguish between text and image, right? And we allow more by way of text than we allow by way of image. Sometimes when it's not wrong to talk about something, it's wrong to show it. And there's a ton of death image litigation in the common law that reflects this idea. Text, describe okay, image not okay. Image might belong to the family. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about that. I should mention that, because this question about the military, so I'm a military brat. My father was in the American Army throughout my childhood, and he was a soldier in Korea, South Korea, and also in Vietnam. When I was in college, my dad was in Vietnam. And I had these nightmares, right, of daddy coming home in a box or in a bag. And I had a friend who worked in the nearby town, worked in a funeral home where the bodies were sent when they came back from Vietnam if the soldiers were stationed in the Fort Benning, Georgia area. And this young man would often describe to me the horrific condition of the corpses. The families never saw that. Those boxes were sealed, and the families didn't have the option of opening them. And that struck me as right. There's a reception for everyone just out in the lobby. Please join us, and please continue the conversation. And join me in thanking Anita Allen for her terrific. Thank you.